Hello everybody, my colleague Mario Sältzer and myself, Sebastian Stier, welcome you to our talk in the Meet the Expert series, and we will talk about the German federal election and using social media data for answering relevant social science research questions. We will talk about the following aspects today. So first I will give you a quick introduction to the topic, hopefully triggering your interest in social media data for political science research and social science research more broadly. Then Marius will take over and he will discuss some of the important and also nitty-gritty details when it comes to collecting social media data, managing social media data, and making sense of all of that data that you can collect from social media platforms. Next, we will see a few applications of a recent data set that we used, that we collected for the German election this year, that hopefully will further trigger your interest in these types of studies and these types of analysis before we come to the aspect of data sharing and the actual scientific reuse of social media data sets. And after that, we will hear about your questions in the Q&A session. So why should we even do that? Why is social media data useful to study elections in Germany and beyond? Digital campaigning has obviously become more and more important, and the backdrop against all of that is this slide here. So what I'm showing you is an increase in demand for political information via digital media, via online channels. So I took data from the German longitudinal election study from our colleagues at GESIS that is running from, or this data set that I was taking here is running from 2009 to 2017. And study participants are asked on how many days in the last week did you read about politics or political parties on the internet. So in 2009, respondents reported on average spending 2.5 days per week getting political information online. And this average has increased to 4 days per week on average in 2017. And I also checked out later versions of the GLES tracking panel that they are using. And the overall averages are pretty similar to what we see here on this slide. So if you're a political actor, a party, a candidate, it is obviously rational to also react to that demand. If citizens use digital platforms, use social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter, increasingly it also makes sense to be present there to move your campaign online, obviously. And this is what happened in the last decade in Germany also. What you see here is data we at GESIS collected since the 2013 campaign on the use of Facebook and Twitter by election candidates. We start with Facebook. We see that in 2017, more than 80% of candidates already had a Facebook account. And it is important to note that we are only looking at the top 7 German parties here. So the major parties that have realistic chances of entering the Bundestag. You will also realize that we do not yet have numbers for Facebook in 2021 because we are still collecting the handles of these candidates, but we estimate that clearly more than 90% of candidates should be present on Facebook right now in the German political space. And interestingly, even on Twitter, which is a medium that is not widely used by the German population, so diffusion numbers range between 5 to 10% of the overall population, even there candidates are present, and nowadays in the 2021 election, more than 60% of candidates from the 7 major parties also had a presence on Twitter. So in this slide, I try to sum up these two perspectives: an increasing demand for political communication information online and an increasing willingness on the supply side, candidates, parties, to actually react to that demand. And that, taken together, should demonstrate that social media campaigning is a relevant phenomenon to study in the social sciences. We have discussed this before, so citizens are increasingly using social network sites. There might be some drop in demand for Facebook, for instance, but other platforms such as Instagram are also becoming more important in political communication. Citizens use social media as information medium. They get information on their Facebook news feeds, and they are also exposed to such information non-intentionally. So not only messages by the accounts that they are following are reaching them, but also messages that are shared by friends, which is also a nice feature if you're a politician. And of course, the corona pandemic also hit the political communication space. It became apparent in surveys in the last year that many citizens really moved to digital channels, that the demand for online news, for instance, really went up during the corona pandemic. On the supply side, we see a upcoming generation of more internet-savvy politicians. And as more younger parliamentarians enter the Bundestag and enter the party system where they are standing as candidates, obviously the importance of digital media and social media will also increase. And another thing that is attractive for politicians is the hybrid media system. So I can not only directly reach the citizens that are following me on social network sites, but instead I am also able to reach multipliers such as journalists, such as party activists, that can translate my message to broader parts of the population. So for instance, if your tweet gets embedded in an online news article, that obviously increases the reach of your campaign message considerably. Another nice feature of social network sites for politicians is that they allow for targeted advertising, meaning that I can on Facebook or also on Twitter, with these paid ads, direct my messages to very particular audiences I'm interested in with certain demographic characteristics, for instance. And lastly, the corona pandemic also hit the supply side of political information. For a year or so, most campaign events really had to be moved online, and parties were investing considerable resources in the last few years to update their online campaigns. So we've now heard a lot of things about online digital campaigning. Why does it matter? It matters for society, but it also matters for us as scientists, and it opens up nice opportunities to do more and interesting substantive research, and also to add to our methodological toolkit. So on the substantive side, of course, social network sites in themselves per se are really important arenas for political communication. We need to take this seriously, and we need to study that accordingly. So people become interconnected online, they exchange perspectives, and that leads to new phenomena that we as social scientists should study. These phenomena can be political mobilization online, if you think about Black Lives Matter, or the Arab revolutions that were often credited to Twitter, but also more negative consequences such as polarization or hate speech that might be related to internet use, or social network sites might just be a venue where these fault lines in society become more apparent. But in any case, we need to study these phenomena that are taking place online. Methodologically, social media also provide distinct, unique advantages. So we get, as social scientists, easy access to really large data sets that are very fine-grained. So these data sets contain text, images, metadata, and metadata means timestamps, interactions of users between each other. So we get really nice interconnected social network data that was really hard to collect with more traditional methods such as surveys. And from a political science perspective, it is really neat that all relevant actors in democracy are basically coming together in one arena. On social network sites, we have politicians, parties, voters, media organizations, journalists, party activists, and they provide data for us that is comparable, that can be studied with something like text analysis, and these actors also interact with each other. So social media can be used as kind of a lens to actually study democratic processes in much more detail than what was possible with more traditional methods. And with that, I hand over to my colleague Marius.
Thank you, Sebastian. So, also welcome from me, and I will give a little introduction, and now after we get this great motivation in why we should collect this data, how we should actually collect this data. And I will focus mostly on Facebook and Instagram, but of course there are other social medias out there that you might access in a similar way. So the question for anyone who starts now with the idea of using social media data for their research is, of course, what's the research question. And based on that, it opens up the opportunity to either use basically audience-centered or elite-centered approaches to collect this data. So what you typically see is, for example, in the media, and in some publications, the concept of keyword searches of social media. So you're interested in a specific election, all context, all tweets, all posts around that. You're interested maybe in a specific topic, like in climate change and so on. Or you might be interested in specific events like the trial, so the debate between the German Chancellor candidates. In this case, you might want to do this audience-centered search where you simply look through keywords and analyze data basically on a population level. The other way to approach this is to target individual political accounts like parties, politicians, but also media users, journalists, I don't know, your local newspaper. And the difference here is that in contrast to keyword-oriented searches, you will get the complete timelines and not only focus on a specific issue, but on all issues of a specific set of users. And what you can do to make these two approaches is using either application programming interfaces or whatever is provided by the respective medium. And we will focus now first on the now more easier way to analyze this kind of data. So in the recent years, of course, Facebook and also Instagram was quite difficult to use as a data source, mainly because they shut down their access to their application programming interfaces after the Cambridge Analytica story. But now Facebook put in a lot of effort to offer access again to academic researchers using the CrowdTangle platform, which is a way for you as a researcher to get access to this data in a controlled way where Facebook can make sure that you use it only for science. And what they're offering here is, next to also an application programming interface and API, a very, very user-friendly interface. So if you're interested in starting out with social media research, this is a great starting point. So what you basically do is you collect the kind of keywords or accounts that you want, you upload them simply to their interface, and then via historical data, you can just get this sent via email in CSV form. This is super, super easy. This also provides to you these nice leaderboards and a nice overview over everything that is happening with the accounts that you uploaded there. And it gives you a very nice introduction. So if you, for example, want to do qualitative coding of Facebook accounts, this is a great way to start. But of course, this has also limitations. So first of all, you can only see public pages, which is of course related to data protection issues, which also makes sense. But what is a little bit more problematic is that you also can see comments, so replies basically to Facebook posts, which makes questions on deliberation and interaction a lot more difficult. Also, up until this point, we have not really reliable API access. It's quite slow to download the data. So even though I'm a big fan of automatization and using scripts for everything right now, the better way is probably using this interface. Another thing is that up until this point, access to images is a little bit difficult because image links extracted from these posts are still in the server state of when they were posted, and you will have to web script them individually. The far bigger issue than these little technical things is, of course, the dependency on Facebook's goodwill. And I don't know if you follow the news in that regard, specifically in the tech community. Facebook is now in a process of internal debate on whether they actually want to go on with this CrowdTangle access in that form, as they are not very happy with the research results that are coming out of it to this point. So, of course, right now, and this is with every API and every access that is provided by these services to outsiders, we have to be very careful about how long we can use this in the future. So if you see this now, maybe this is a good time to start and download everything you need for your research. Well, Facebook has always been either very closed or very open. This is in contrast now to Twitter, which has always been very stable and offered a lot of information to researchers over the years. So up until recently, we mainly used the Twitter API to call all kinds of data from statistics software languages like R or from Python. We got actually pretty reliable data over the years out of there. But with the Twitter API, you can collect hashtags, but only up to 1 week backwards. You can get the most recent tweets from timelines, but only 3,200, which is, of course, good for if you are interested in a specific campaign, but not so good if you want to really do historical analysis. What you always have, of course, is rate limitations. So the number of calls that you can make is limited, which is a little bit problematic for larger follower networks. But if you're really interested in this long-term analysis of political things, then the number, then really the problem is the timeline access, I assume. But there we have a fundamental change in the recent year. The new academic research product track. So before, you could use the free Twitter API, and you also could get additional access if you paid for it. But now Twitter provides this kind of data access to academic researchers if you can show your affiliation. So if you create a Twitter account, fill out a form and wait for Twitter to respond, they will typically give you access to the academic research track that contains all kinds of historical data. And this really allows you to go back in time. So you can get all tweets of a specific account, the complete timelines, of course, not the stuff that was deleted, but of course, you can go back a long time. And you can get not only timelines, but also the use of hashtags over the last couple of years. But of course, this has its own little problems. It requires research affiliation, just like CrowdTangle does. And they're actually quite heavy rate limits in terms of how much you can call per hour. So if you have a larger data project, you might try to find a way around this by combining the academic and the regular API. And there's also a hard cap on 10 million tweets a month, which I assume is not relevant for most researchers that see this presentation. So now the question is, after you get all this nice data, whether as a CSV file from CrowdTangle or as JSON files in the Twitter API, and the question is, what do you do with it? So this is maybe the biggest contribution you can make as a data collection expert here, is to offer some best practices and making it a statement here that it's super important how you manage your data. that you get out of there. Because in contrast to survey data, it is not usually a one-shot thing, and the data collection process is never really stopping. So you get all this data every day. And it's very, very important to keep an overview of what you're doing. So if you have a small research project, you can typically use either CrowdTangle or the Twitter API, like for example in R with the RTweet package. You typically have auto parsers that just create a table of data. And that is okay for these smaller projects. But as soon as you go to medium size, so like for more than 1 million tweets or more than 2 million tweets, when you, like in what I'm going to show you a little bit later, you look at the whole campaign, then it's very important to get an overview of what you're really doing. And you should store all the metadata that you can have, and maybe even store the relational constructs between these different posts and accounts and all the metadata that you're combining with it in your local database. And then one step further, if you're really doing a large project, if you like at GESIS monitor social media over years, maybe even over 10 years, so, then it really my suggestion is that you really move this on a server and to cloud-based, automatized collection process with a relational database and the data storage. And typically, if you want to set up something like that, your university IT department might be helping you with that. But it's very important to keep an overview over this data. So now the question is, after we store this data, what do we do with it? And I'm bringing you today a little application just to give you an overview of how useful it can be to do an overall text analysis over all this data that you can collect here. And the example here is the German federal election 2021. And it's based on a data set that we published on the GESIS data archive that contains all Twitter accounts of all candidates of the 7 major parties, so about 1,200 Twitter accounts. And today I will show you a little analysis, a very preliminary analysis on the campaign. Yeah. So the use case here is one of the main advantages of social media. So one advantage is, of course, time series data. So you can see what a party is doing over time. But what you can also see is what individuals are doing. And we all know that parties are not monolithic actors. They are a collection of individuals, maybe with their own interests. If you look into the CDU right now, it becomes very obvious that there are different conflicts going on. And this is super important for party positioning for the future. So where does the CDU place itself? Does it get more conservative? Does it get more liberal? However. And of course, their individuals are very important. It's not just who's the party leader, but also how do candidates differ from MPs. So it's actually relevant who wins an election in their district, because it might change the party group. The question is leaders or backbenchers. So who's really trying to push the party in which direction? We see regional differentiation. This is most extreme maybe with Die Linke, with the left party, and the AfD, where we have big differences between the different areas in Germany in terms of how culturally conservative they are. And we also have wings inside of parties that try to shape the future. And one great example, I think, is this guy. And if you have been following the German federal election, you know who that is. That is Hans-Georg Maaßen, who was the leader of the of an internal secret service in Germany and got sacked, and then became basically a right-wing rogue candidate inside the center-right Christian Democratic Party. And this is a great example of how individual politicians, even if they are not party leaders, can use social media and position themselves. So here he's actively criticizing the migration policy of his own party. And is actively taking positions against that in a way that he might be confused with a candidate for the right-wing populist party AfD. And what we are doing now here, we are trying to move away a little bit from this anecdotal evidence and try to generalize it to all the politicians. So what we want to do is we want to see whether politicians emphasize issues that are not necessarily indicative of their own party, but instead move in the other direction. So for example, here with Hans-Georg Maaßen, is he maybe talking about things that are not in the core program of the CDU and instead indicative of other parties. And we do that for all tweets since 2020 to estimate stable ideal points, we call it in political science, using dimensional reduction. So what we're actually doing is some sort of latent semantic analysis and checking what kind of terms are really typical for different dimensions in the political space. And what we try to do here is we try to derive a left-right dimension, actually a cultural and an economic left-right dimension of these members, of these candidates. And what we see here now is how they cluster in political space only based on what they are tweeting about. So this is the German political Twitter sphere of all those politicians that have enough features to identify. And here we see, based on the colors, very nicely that the left and the Greens are clustering and overlapping with the SPD, and the SPD overlaps with the CDU. And we see something like that could be identifiable as a left-right scale that is more economically minded on the y-axis, and a more cultural left-right scale on the x-axis. And what does this really mean? If you're really looking into into what kind of terms they are using. So there are terms that are indicative of the left side here, and there are terms that are indicative of the right side, and there are terms indicative of being economically liberal, and terms that are indicative of being economically conservative, like here on the top with the FDP. Let's now look a little bit deeper in what this AfD cluster is really talking about and what makes you an AfD member based on your content. So we can see actually a lot of issues that are connected to migration. So we have here Muslim and being forced to leave Germany, and focus on clans, which is related to crime by immigrants, and also the focus on leftist terrorism and some really extreme terms like Schießbefehl, which means shooting people on the border. And we can see that this dimension is obviously placed here, and now we can see where Maaßen, based on only the terms that he's using in his tweets, would be placed in this dimension. And we can see that any machine learning algorithm would probably assume that Maaßen is not a member of the CDU, but based on the terminology he's using in his tweets, is rather a right-wing populist. And I hope this demonstrates a little bit how we can get an overview over everything that is happening on social media, all the big data that we're collecting, and how we can make use of this for all kinds of interesting, relevant questions in political science.
Thank you, Marius. And now the question is, how can you also profit from the data that we have been collecting, and how can you perform similar analysis like the one we just saw? And first, I will show you all of the data sets that we have been collecting at GESIS since the 2013 German election. So since then, we have always conducted considerable or have invested considerable efforts to research all of the candidates of all of the accounts of the candidates that were standing in these elections since then, including the European Parliament election in 2019. And I will now talk about what you can actually get if you go to these data sources on the GESIS data archive. So the slides will be available in a few days, and then you can click on all of these links and download these data sets yourself. Generally, sharing social media data is complicated. It's really a thorny issue, and scientific reuse of social media data is something that is really making our lives at GESIS a bit difficult. So the terms of conditions of social media platforms generally prohibit data sharing. We cannot just dump some Twitter data set online and make it available for downloading. We cannot even send other researchers Twitter data we collected via email. That is prohibited by these terms and conditions. And obviously, this can lead to severe problems. If you think about the scientific process, there might be a replication crisis in the making if we cannot scrutinize the findings of other research teams and if we cannot reuse the data that research teams before us actually collected. But at least when it comes to these elite-centered analysis, there are now well-established, robust ways of implicitly sharing that data. So on Twitter, or we researchers using Twitter data, we can share tweet IDs. So we can give you CSV files or TXT files, long lists of IDs of tweets that are unique, and then US researchers can use Python or R scripts to rehydrate these tweets, meaning that you can reconstruct the data sets like we used it in our analysis. And what we did since 2013 was we shared all of these relevant accounts. So if you download the data from the GESIS data archive, you will see all candidates that were standing in the elections, and you will see their Facebook and Twitter accounts, and for 2021 election, soon also their Instagram accounts. And using CrowdTangle and the Twitter API, like Marius showed you before, you can then reconstruct all of the historical data that these candidates ever sent on Twitter and also on Facebook and Instagram. So these account-based lists obviously help you getting historical data on previous elections also. One major caveat is that all deleted posts will be lost. So you can always just retrieve the data that is now available on Twitter or Facebook, meaning that some of the tweets that we used in our original analysis will be lost if you get the data a few years or months later. But that is obviously what is prescribed in the European data protection law and the right to be forgotten. If you're further interested in these questions, I can recommend you the Meet the Experts talk by our colleagues Katrin Weller and Oliver Watteller, who talked about the ethics of social media research and the problems that are associated with sharing social media data. And with that, we already come to the conclusion. So I hope there are some takeaways that will help you in your research endeavors using social media data. The most important one might be that you first need to properly think about your research goals, your research questions, and conceptualize your data collection accordingly. One question that social media researchers should always ask themselves is, do I even need social media data for this research question? Can't I go to GESIS and just download a cross-sectional data set from the German longitudinal election study? So these are the questions one should ask before drowning in Twitter data and not knowing what to actually do with the data. Ideally, we would also develop some expectations, some hypotheses before downloading the data, because if you have the data and you have 1 million rows in your data set, it's really intriguing to just dig deeper into the data, do some exploratory analysis, and get lost. So it's really important to think about the literature's research questions that you want to address with the specific data you collect. Marius also showed you that thinking about the scope of the project and the long-term vision of a given project is also important, that these data management issues are really important, that server infrastructures, SQL databases can help you organize the data if you have more long-term goals with your data collection. So we also talked about problems. There are still unresolved issues, but we think that social media really holds huge and really largely untapped potential for studying election campaigns. In political science, we might have used this data in several of our publications in the last few years, and this is certainly something that political scientists have on their radar. But I think that in other disciplines, there's also a lot of potential for doing nice theory-driven studies using social media data. And we hope that this talk helped you developing some of these ideas for such projects. With that, we conclude our talk. We thank you for your attention.